Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we're looking at the life of a poet who completely defied the literary establishment, basically by just outwriting them.
Yeah, outwriting them by a mile.
Right. We are exploring the fascinating and honestly unapologetically prolific life of a woman who built an entire empire completely outside the traditional gatekeeping of the academic world.
It's such a fascinating study of creative rebellion.
Yeah.
And to piece this narrative together for you today, we're pulling from three very different sources.
Very different.
Yeah. So first, we have an intimate, reflective 2018 interview from the Open Arts Forum. Then we've got a really fiery, highly emotional 2025 tribute blog post by a literary editor named Scott Holstad. And finally, a rather unexpected document, which is a 2019 program guide from the Albany Public Library in New York.
And that library guide really is the wild card in the stack, but I promise you it brings the whole story together in the end.
Oh, it absolutely does. Because when we synthesize these three documents, we get this vivid, multidimensional portrait of a woman who became known as the Queen of the Small Presses.
The Queen of the Small Presses.
Exactly. This was a writer who refused to wait around for permission to create. She just bypassed the traditional academic gatekeepers through sheer overwhelming artistic output.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when we say unstoppable output, we really need to look at the actual numbers here. According to Scott Holstad's blog post, this woman, her name is Lyn Lifshin, she published roughly 150 books and chapbooks in her lifetime.
Yeah, that volume of work is just staggering. And it's probably worth defining what that actually looks like for a second. For context, a chapbook is usually a small, saddle-stitched booklet, maybe like 20 to 40 pages long. They're often put out by independent, underground micropresses, so it's a very grassroots, DIY way of publishing. But even factoring that in, 150 publications totally defies that conventional image we have of the tortured poet who, agonizes over a single stanza for 6 months.
Oh, it completely shatters that stereotype. She wasn't treating poetry as some polite, refined hobby reserved for a Sunday afternoon in a quiet study. For her, it was a visceral survival mechanism.
Absolutely.
She said it explicitly in that 2018 interview. She said, "I don't feel alive unless I'm writing." It was like a compulsion that carried her through the darkest moments of her life.
Which is perfectly illustrated by how she handled conflict. She took the raw, messy, sometimes really destructive material of real life and just immediately transmuted it into art.
The CPR doll story from the interview is, well, it's the perfect example of that.
It's so good.
She talks about being absolutely enraged at an ex-lover. Apparently, they were having this massive fight, and he was running around, going into his closet and slashing to pieces one of those resuscitating Annie dolls.
The ones they used to teach CPR.
Exactly, the CPR training dolls.
It is such a bizarre, chaotic image to begin with.
Right, like he's destroying this plastic doll in a blind rage, and she is so furious watching him do this that she takes the slashed-up doll, cuts it into even more pieces herself.
Naturally.
Yeah, grabs a few of his shirts, cuts those up too, and then channels all of that explosive, destructive energy straight to her typewriter. She immediately wrote a poem called No More Apologizing.
And the incredible irony here is that No More Apologizing went on to become one of her most heavily anthologized pieces.
Wow.
It perfectly encapsulates her whole ethos. She didn't wait for the emotion to cool down so she could recollect it in tranquility, She wrote from right inside the blast radius. And this is exactly the quality that Scott Holstad focuses on in his tribute blog.
Yeah, he draws a really sharp contrast between Lifshin and the traditional academic poets, doesn't he?
He really does, and he does not mince words about it either. Holstad writes with deep frustration about academics who, at least in his view, take these comfortable university sabbaticals to quote-unquote mentally masturbate and then maybe manage to produce a couple of thin books in their entire lifetimes.
Right.
He saw Lifshin's relentless, almost blue-collar work ethic as the antidote to that kind of sterility.
Because he criticizes those academic writers for writing bloodless poems about things like robins at sunrise, while simultaneously looking down their noses at someone like Lifshin, who was actually out in the trenches documenting the messy reality of life. And reading Holstad's blog, you can really feel his intense loyalty to her and to the entire rebellious literary circle that she ran in. I mean, he's writing this piece while actively mourning the deaths of several of those friends, including a writer named Jerry Laughlin, who he notes died from COVID.
Yeah, Holstad's grief in this blog is incredibly raw,
Mm.
and it actually spills over into a very fiery political stance. He directly blames his friend's passing on, and I'm quoting here, white Christian nationalist science denying alt-right Republicans.
Wow.
Now, just to be very clear to you listening, our goal today is not to validate or debate those politics. We are not taking sides here.
Right, absolutely not.
We're strictly looking at this source to show you the intense, highly charged emotional world that Lifshin and her circle operated in. It was a landscape of very fierce loyalties and completely unfiltered opinions.
That context really helps explain the energy of the small press world at that time. But it also brings up a pretty practical question for me. Surely writing But how does someone even generate enough material to fill that many pages without constantly just repeating themselves?
You'd really think she would run dry, but her research methods were incredibly immersive. There's this fascinating story in the interview about an anthology called Mondo Barbie.
Oh, yeah.
An editor reached out and asked her to contribute a poem about Barbie dolls. Now, Lifshin realized she'd never actually owned a Barbie, and she didn't have a daughter who had one either.
Which is the exact point where most writers would probably just decline the invitation.
Yeah.
Just, sorry, not my area of expertise.
Oh, but not Lifshin. She happened to be doing a reading at the Palmer House in Chicago at the time, so she just left the hotel and started wandering into New Buy toy stores.
As you do.
Yeah, she stood there looking at the dolls, reading the backs of the Barbie boxes, flipping through Barbie books, just trying to completely absorb the sense of the doll.
And from that one single afternoon of wandering around a toy store, she generated about 70 poems. That is just wild to me.
It's a real testament to her observational skills, and she used that exact same method of deep empathetic projection for other subjects too. The interview details a whole series she wrote about Marilyn Monroe.
The Marilyn Monroe series is so interesting because she was using the icon to process her own feelings of displacement. Lifshin had just moved to Washington, D.C. from upstate New York, and she was feeling entirely unmoored. Everything was new and strange and unfamiliar to her, so she started wandering around the National Gallery, the Corcoran-DuPont Circle.
But she wasn't just walking.
Right, she was projecting. She imagined Marilyn Monroe wandering around that exact same city.
Yeah, she pictured Marilyn feeling lonely, bored, like a total misfit trapped in a fancy mansion, completely unsure of her future.
She would sit by her window seat, looking out at the Washington Monument, and just free flow, imagining Marilyn's dreams and fears, using the actual physical landscape of D.C. to anchor it all.
What's fascinating here is Lifshin's underlying philosophy on what art actually is and what constitutes truth in poetry. It wasn't about biographical fact for her, it was about emotional resonance. She taught creative writing frequently in the Tri-City area of New York, and she would tell her students something that always made them giggle.
What was that?
She'd say, "Details make the lie more believable."
That is a little provocative, but it makes perfect sense when you really think about it.
It does. She firmly believed that a poem is essentially an artificial construct. It's a quote-unquote lie that has the total freedom to go wherever the writer wants it to go. You don't owe the reader strict journalism. But to make that lie resonate, to make it emotionally true, you have to anchor it in specific, tangible sensory details. And for Lifshin, the inspiration for those details was everywhere.
You really start to see the democratization of creativity in her approach. She clearly didn't believe you had to wait for some grand epiphany on a mountaintop to write a poem.
No, she actively looked for the profound in the mundane. She talked about catching fragments of conversation while eavesdropping on the metro. She'd write on the wrappers of Wrigley's spearmint gum if an idea struck her and she didn't have a notebook handy.
Gum wrappers.
Yeah. She looked at everyday, even gritty objects like a cigarette-burned coffee table, old phone books, stained sheets, and she saw that every single object was bursting with potential narratives.
She clearly felt this constant buzzing connection to the physical world around her, which is a really interesting contrast, actually, because internally the sources show her perspective was deeply rooted in feeling disconnected. Like she felt like a total outsider from a very young age.
That sense of alienation is such a crucial piece of her puzzle. In the Open Arts Forum interview, she opens up about growing up in a small New England town that was strictly, almost rigidly divided between Catholics and Protestants. That was the binary. If you didn't go to the Catholic school, you were considered Protestant and vice versa.
But her family was Jewish. She noted they were one of only 2 Jewish families in the entire town. It was so socially isolating that she remembered her family actually shoving their little commercial Christmas tree into a closet whenever her Jewish grandfather would come up the stairs to visit.
The visual of literally hiding a tree in a closet really speaks to that fractured sense of belonging she had. She was navigating a world where her identity simply didn't fit the available categories, so she had to hide parts of her life depending on who was in the room at the time. She recalled how Easter made her feel particularly alien, sitting on her porch and just watching throngs of people in pastel clothes passing by their front yard on Main Street.
And the sources show it wasn't just benign exclusion either. There was active, aggressive hostility. She explicitly recalled walking into her high school classroom and seeing the anti-Semitic slur kike written on the blackboard and knowing instantly that it was directed at her.
That's awful.
It is. And even later in life, when she joined a Jewish sorority in college, she still felt like an outsider because she didn't know the Yiddish phrases her roommate with a Rochester accent tried to teach her. She just couldn't find a place where she fit seamlessly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that early, deeply ingrained feeling of isolation maps directly onto her position in the literary world as an adult. It completely explains why she naturally avoided the cliquishness of the academy.
Now, for those listening who might not be familiar with the inner workings of the poetry world, how would you define the academy in this context?
It's essentially the traditional university system that dictates literary success. The standard path is highly structured and very risk-averse. You get an MFA, you secure a teaching job, you spend months meticulously polishing maybe 3 to 5 poems to submit to a prestigious journal, and you hope you get published so you can eventually get tenure.
Sounds exhausting.
It is. And as Lifshin noted, it's a system where graduate poets build little followings, they assign their own friends' works in their syllabi, and they award each other prizes. It's highly political and very exclusionary.
It sounds remarkably similar to the divided, cliquish town she grew up in.
It really is the exact same dynamic, just with different labels, and she saw right through it. She refused to play that game, opting instead for the chaotic freedom of the underground small presses.
But she ultimately got the absolute best kind of vindication. She succeeded wildly on her own terms, and then she beat the academic snobs at their own game. Holstad points out in his blog that her massive 300-page book, Cold Comfort, was published by Black Sparrow Press.
Which is a legendary accomplishment in the independent publishing world.
Exactly. For some context for you listening, Black Sparrow Press is the exact same publisher that put out Charles Bukowski. He is essentially the patron saint of anti-academic populist poetry. So to be published by Black Sparrow is basically to be knighted by the underground.
It was a massive validation of her approach. But Holstad highlights this incredibly delicious irony hidden right at the front of Cold Comfort.
I love this part.
The academic gatekeepers had always dismissed her because she published constantly in these obscure, staple-bound zines. But if you open Cold Comfort and look at the acknowledgments page, which lists where the individual poems were first published, it was absolutely packed with the most elite, mainstream, highly respected literary journals in the country.
We are talking the Chicago Review, Plowshares, the Georgia Review. Solstad says it perfectly. She played in their yard, and she did it better than they did. She had the raw talent to sit alongside the academic elite, but she deliberately chose to operate with the manic, unfiltered energy of the underground.
Which brings us to a fantastic anecdote from Holstad's time editing a journal called Ray's Road Review. It really illustrates the sheer physical weight of her creative output. As an editor, he was used to writers following the rules, meticulously selecting and submitting a polite envelope with 3 to 5 carefully typed poems.
But when Lifshin wanted to submit to his journal, she completely ignored the rules. She would routinely mail him 75 pages of poetry at a single time. Just imagine being an editor and opening an envelope to find a 75-page avalanche of words from one person.
She was an absolute force of nature, and because her work was so consistently good, Holstad ended up essentially publishing 2 full books of her poetry in a serial format over the years without even intending to. She didn't just participate in the small press community, she overwhelmed it. She sustained it with her energy.
But there's a twist here. We've spent this whole time painting her as an underground rebel, right? An outsider who thumbed her nose at institutions. But our third source paints a totally different picture. Here's where it gets really interesting. If we pull out that 2019 Albany Public Library Special Events Guide, we see a completely different angle on her legacy.
Because when you look at a community library guide, you're looking at the everyday heartbeat of a city. It's the ultimate record of what a local community actually values.
You open this specific guide, and it is full of this vibrant, mundane, wonderful reality of local life. There are notices for classes on 3D printing in the Albany Made Creative Lab.
Right.
There are flash fiction workshops, there are Scrabble evenings, and people gathering to make DIY busy bags for toddlers. It's just normal people living their lives.
Right.
But hidden right there, amidst the knitting clubs and the Scrabble games, is a notice for a major event. The 6th Annual APR Foundation Literary Legends Gala, held on October 19, 2019 at the Washington Avenue branch.
And right there in the center of her community, Lyn Lifshin is being honored as a literary legend, alongside novelist Peter Golden and poet Dan Wilcox. It completely reshapes that narrative of the isolated outsider rebel. Yes, she defied the academic elite, and yes, she operated on the fringes of the small press world nationally. But locally, in her own physical community, she wasn't an outcast at all. She was a celebrated titan.
The juxtaposition is just amazing. The woman writing about /CPR dolls is being honored in the exact same building where people are making toddler busy bags. It really proves that you don't need the ivory tower to be recognized for your brilliance. And the library guide also points out that earlier that same week, there was a screening of a documentary about her life called Lyn Lifshin, not made of glass, at the nearby Opelka Gallery. And here's the kicker, that documentary was made in 1987.
They were screening a documentary made about her over 30 years prior that shows a profound, sustained impact on her local culture that spans decades. Her sheer persistence, that absolute obsession to document life that she described in her interview, ultimately cemented her legacy not just in the pages of obscure zines, but in the physical, enduring institutions of her own community.
So what does this all mean? Why are we doing a deep dive into Lyn Lifshin for you today?
Yeah.
Why should you, listening right now, care about a poet who published 150 books you might never have heard of?
Because Lifshin's life is an absolute masterclass in not waiting for permission. It doesn't matter if you're an aspiring artist or if you're prepping for a corporate meeting or just trying to learn a new skill. Lifshin's story is a blazing reminder that you do not need the traditional gatekeepers to validate you before you begin. You don't need a board of directors or an academy or a clique of insiders to tell you that your voice matters. You just need to produce. You need to observe the details around you, trust your own senses, and do the work.
She gives us all permission to just start. You don't need to have lived a profoundly tragic or globally historic life to create something meaningful. You just need to pay attention. You just need to look at where a head touched the back of a chair or a stain on a coffee table and use your imagination to build a lifetime around it. The stories were already there. You just have to be willing to see them.
It's the ultimate democratization of creativity. Art isn't just for the people who can afford to take sabbaticals. It's for the person riding the metro, listening to the conversations around them, and writing on a gum wrapper.
What an incredible journey we've tracked today. We started with a young girl feeling like a total outsider in a divided New England town, literally hiding her Christmas tree in a closet to avoid friction. And we followed her as she transformed that isolation into an absolute superpower, becoming the unapologetic 150-book publishing queen of the small presses, who beat the elite literary journals at their own game, and was ultimately crowned a true literary legend by her local library.
It is a triumphant story. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought based on these sources. We know from Scott Holstad's blog that Lyn Lifshin passed away recently, and in his tribute, Holstad mentions this very real, very modern panic. He talks about the anxiety of trying to digitally archive out-of-print books to save them from disappearing forever. And this raises a really compelling question for you to mull over in our digital age. What actually happens to the physical legacy of someone like Lifshin?
That is a tough question, because her entire life's work was deliberately scattered across thousands of obscure, fragile, small press paper magazines.
Exactly. Many of those independent publishers are long gone. The cheap paper they used is degrading. So, is her true immortality found in the panicked attempt to preserve those physical pages she left behind? Or is her real legacy the rebellious, unstoppable spirit of creation she represented? A spirit that lives on in anyone who decides to just sit down and write without asking for permission.
That is definitely something to think about the next time you hold a physical book, or the next time you feel the urge to create something of your own and wonder if you're quote-unquote allowed to do it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary life of Lyn Lifshin. We hope it sparked something in you today. Until next time, keep observing the world around you and stay curious.